Hello, and welcome to my latest data protection update and reminder training. For those of you that don't already know me, my name is Alvin Scott, and I'm the Data Protection Officer for all of the Devon Moors Federation schools, as well as a number of other schools around Devon which are not members of the Federation. In today's training, I'll be looking at some of the data protection issues that have happened since my last training, as well as providing some brief reminders of the most important practices of which you should be aware when working in your school. Personal data, which is information that relates to an identifiable living person, is being increasingly protected across the world. Foremost in this improved protection was the introduction across most of Europe of the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR as it is better known. When the GDPR was introduced in 2018, it was groundbreaking in the level of data protection it provided. GDPR is now considered to be the blue ribbon standard of data protection, and it has become the model for similar data protection legislation that is being introduced across the world. It is predicted that by the end of this year, modern privacy laws offering a similar level of protection to that provided by GDPR will cover the personal information of 3/4 of the world's population. Personal data belonging to UK citizens is now protected by the UK's own version of the original GDPR. This new version was introduced when the UK left the EU as a result of Brexit. In order to differentiate it from the original EU-wide version, this new UK-only version has become known as the UK GDPR, and it sits alongside another piece of UK legislation, the Data Protection Act 2018. In the UK, data protection is overseen by the Information Commissioner's Office, more often known as the ICO. At the head of the ICO is the UK's Information Commissioner. The current Information Commissioner is John Edwards. Since Brexit, the UK government has been consulting on its proposed Data Protection Digital Information Bill. The bill was introduced to Parliament in July 2022, and it proposes amendments across a variety of aspects of existing data protection legislation. The bill's passage through Parliament was paused last autumn as a result of the leadership changes in the government. The opportunity was taken to invite further consultation, and then the bill was reintroduced to Parliament in March 2023 as the Data Protection and Digital Information No. 2 Bill. The government's declared intention in introducing the bill is to make the data protection legislation simpler and clearer. Potential modifications include the following: changes to the records that must be kept as they relate to low-risk activities, changes addressing the challenges presented by the ever-increasing involvement of AI in aspects of data processing. This is something we will hear hearing more and more about in the not-too-distant future, I'm sure. There should be a new obligation placed on those providing email services to notify the ICO directly when they suspect that someone is contravening direct marketing rules. And there is also proposed changes to the structure of the ICO itself, moving away from having a single information commissioner and instead establishing an independent board with a chief executive. If the bill gets passed into law in its present form, the shape of data protection in the UK may change quite significantly. I think it's worth having a brief reminder of the basic roles of those involved in data protection. The data controller. This is the school itself, not an individual person, so you can't actually ask to speak to the data controller. Similarly, if we were talking about a commercial company, the data controller would be the company itself, not an individual within that company. A school or company is advised by their data protection officer, DPO, who is an individual person, who deals with data protection issues for them. My role as the school's data protection officer involves a number of responsibilities. I act as the point of contact and advice for school staff, for the public, and for the ICO. I provide training for staff, which is now a statutory requirement, and assist in the creation of paperwork to make sure it is GDPR compliant. I assist with subject access requests. This is something where individuals ask for a copy of the information that the school holds on them, and I also redact the documentation as necessary on the school's behalf to ensure that it does not include anything that should not be shared with them. I also investigate any reported data breaches and advise on what action might need to be taken and decide whether it needs to be reported to the ICO. I spend an increasing amount of my time dealing with aspects of freedom of information compliance, including advising schools on the freedom of information requests they have received for information about its activities and actions as a public body. I also assist in the preparation of information relating to data protection in preparation for DCC audits and for Ofsted inspections. Each school is obliged to inform those whose data it processes about what information the school collects and what happens to that data. This information is set out in each school's individual privacy notice. There are separate privacy notices for different types of people. So for example, there'll be one for parents and pupils, a separate one for staff, another one again for governors, and finally one also for any other volunteers that the school might have. The appropriate notice should be made available whenever personal data is being collected from someone. The privacy notice for parents or carers is posted on the school's website. In March 2023, TikTok was banned from being used on UK government devices. This followed on from Parliament having closed its TikTok account in August 2022. In December 2022, the US had banned TikTok from official devices, and the European Commission followed suit, and Canada, Belgium, France, Norway and India all took similar action. The ban relates to concerns about the data privacy practices of the Chinese-owned app. The ban is described as precautionary and proportionate and is based on a specific risk with government devices. The move has been made because TikTok users are required to hand over data, including contacts, user content, and geolocation information. Chinese intelligence law requires organizations to help the Communist Party when requested. The concern is that sensitive information stored on government devices could thus find its way into the hands of Chinese government. The ban applies to work devices used by ministers and civil servants, but does not extend to their personal devices nor to the general public. ByteDance, who own TikTok, says it is disappointed with this decision. Nonetheless, they have announced plans to further protect European user data and create a secure enclave for European TikTok user data. Meanwhile, China itself has been blocking the use of Western social media apps for over a decade. In a move separate to the concerns of governments, weeks after the UK TikTok ban was introduced, the ICO fined TikTok £12.7 million for illegally processing the personal data of more than 1 million UK children under the age of 13 who were using its platform without parental consent. The ICO said that TikTok had done very little, if anything, to check who was using the platform and to remove underage users, in spite of having received internal warnings from senior staff that the firm was flouting its own terms and conditions. The ICO's decision relates to TikTok's activities between May 2018 and July 2020, which predates the Children's Code, which was introduced in September 2021, and which makes it more explicit that platforms cannot argue ignorance over the ages of younger users as a defense for failing to treat their personal data appropriately. Since the fine was imposed, TikTok has introduced more appropriate checks and balances. In August 2023, the Police Service of Northern Ireland hopelessly mishandled a simple freedom of information request and ended up unintentionally disclosing the details of around 10,000 of its employees. Freedom of information requests are made when information is required about an aspect of how a publicly funded organisation is being run. They differ from subject access requests, or SARs, in that SARs relate to providing individuals with information about themselves. Instead of providing just generic, non-personal data in response to the FOIA request, the PSNI posted a spreadsheet online that unintentionally contained a worksheet listing details of the surname, initials, rank, grade, location and department of all current PSNI officers and civilian staff. The breach highlighted the risks involved in answering something as apparently harmless and straightforward as an FOIA request, and the importance of providing adequate staff training on data protection. An independent review of the breach has just been published, and this made 37 recommendations on how data protection needed to be improved. That PSNI data breach caused 2 other unrelated recent data breaches to be publicised which also involved their staff. In July, a police-issued laptop and radio, as well as a document containing the names of more than 200 staff, were all stolen from a private vehicle in County Antrim. The following month, a PSNI laptop and a police officer's notebook fell from the roof of a moving car on the M2 in Belfast. The PSNI said the laptop that fell off the vehicle onto the M2 was recovered and was, quote, immediately deactivated, although one would have thought that a laptop falling at motorway speeds from the roof of a car would have already deactivated itself. Meanwhile, only some sections of the notebook containing details of 42 officers and staff were ever recovered. The ICO has issued a reprimand to the Department for Education for them allowing the prolonged misuse of personal data of up to 28 million children over the age of 14. The ICO's investigation drew the conclusion that poor due diligence by the DfE had resulted in its Learning Records Service database being used by an employment screening firm on behalf of gambling companies in order to help them verify if customers opening online accounts were over 18. The ICO described the processes that had been put in place by the DfE as woeful. Data was being misused, and they were totally unaware that there was even a problem until the national newspaper told them what was happening. The ICO described this use of the database as being unacceptable. The ICO has issued new guidance on how it intends to deal with organisations that fail to meet Freedom of Information requests that they've received, and has confirmed its intention to issue enforcement notices. The ICO is also continuing to issue fines if it finds that insufficient care has been taken to protect personal data. For example, in October 2022, they issued a £4.4 million fine to the construction company Interserve for not keeping its staff's personal data secure. Although this particular company is in the construction sector, what happened to them is quite instructive, and the lessons that have been learned from it apply to all organisations. The ICO found that the company failed to put appropriate security measures in place to prevent a cyber attack. This enabled hackers to access personal data via a phishing email. Compromised data included contact details, national insurance numbers, bank account details, and special category data including ethnic origin, religion, details of any disabilities, sexual orientation, and health information. John Edwards, the UK Information Commissioner, said, "The biggest cyber risk businesses face is not from hackers outside of their company, but from complacency within their company." He warned that fines should be expected wherever similar failures occur. The failures the ICO identified included a lack of adequate staff training and outdated software systems, which ultimately left them vulnerable to a cyber attack. That particular data breach resulted from an Interserve employee forwarding a phishing email to a colleague. This employee opened it, quite possibly put off guard by the fact that it had been forwarded to them by someone they knew, which made them assume it was genuine. They then downloaded the content from the email, which resulted in the installation of malware onto that employee's computer. Although the company's antivirus quarantined the malware that had been installed and sent out an alert, Interserve failed to investigate the suspicious activity thoroughly enough. This resulted in them failing to notice that the attacker still had access to the company's systems. The attacker subsequently compromised 283 systems and uninstalled the company's antivirus solution. Personal data of up to 113,000 current and former employees was encrypted and rendered unavailable. An awareness of what a phishing email looks like is an essential step in preventing a successful attack. All the following may be indicators of a phishing email. It is unexpected. This is a really important red flag that should make you instantly suspicious. It has no greeting or just a generic one such as Dear Account Holder or Dear Customer. There is poor spelling or grammar. Hardly any of these emails originate from the UK, with most coming from Russia and Eastern Europe. There's a requirement for urgent action to be taken. There's often a warning that if you don't act immediately, something bad will happen, such as you being locked out of your account. It requests sensitive information, for example, financial information. And all the email contains a link to a web page or to an attachment, which, if you click on it, will, unbeknown to you, instigate the installation of malware. One of the commonest types of fraudulent emails involves the supposed invoice. Below is an example of one that arrived in my inbox. This example displays a number of red flags that we have just discussed. It is unexpected. There is no greeting. It relates to financial information, and it contains an attachment or link. There are no proper contact details at the end of the message. Also, the message claims that the invoice is a PDF, but the link shows that it is actually a link to a website. The message also mentions a familiar, well-respected company, Adobe, in the pretense of respectability. Scam messages are increasingly including content which you would only associate with genuine emails. For example, they are copying the confidentiality statement the company uses at the end of their genuine emails. By recognizing all these warning signs, you can be 100% confident that this is not a genuine message. I'd now like to discuss a bit more about data breaches. 3 of the top 6 causes of data breaches in education result from criminals gaining access to computers. Beyond having appropriate technical measures in place and the obligatory use of protective software, criminal access to computer systems can almost entirely be prevented using a combination of 3 protective measures. Firstly, staff need to be able to recognize what a phishing email looks like so they don't fall for a phishing attack. Secondly, no weak passwords should be used across the system. And finally, 2-factor authentication should be in place on your most important accounts. As I have already discussed phishing, we will now concentrate on the use of passwords and 2-factor authentication. Incidentally, the following advice applies equally to your personal accounts at home as it does to your work accounts at school. One of the commonest ways that criminals gain access to computer systems is when someone has used a weak password that can simply be guessed. Passwords become infinitely stronger the longer they become. Unfortunately, this also means that they become harder to remember and also to keep track of as you are typing them in. The easiest way to create a nice long, strong password that gets around these problems is to base one on 3 totally unconnected words. The 3 words should not include words that may be easily guessed, such as the name of family members, pets, or significant places, as this kind of information can often be found on social media accounts and so can easily be guessed. The easiest way to find 3 unconnected words is to randomly open a dictionary in 3 places and choose a word each time. When I did this myself, I ended up with the 3 words concentrate, economic, and scrunch. Of course, a password just made up of 3 words doesn't meet the password criteria commonly required by websites, which, for example, might specify the use of a capital letter, a number, and a symbol. Adding a capital at the start of each word and a number and symbol at the end solves this problem and will result in a password similar to this. Needless to say, the same password should never be used across different accounts. You should also never store a list of passwords in an unprotected file on your computer. A lot of people actually do this, either as a Word file or as an Excel file. It is sometimes thought that keeping them in an Excel file is somehow more secure, presumably because spreadsheets are generally considered to be more complex than a Word document. But of course, a spreadsheet isn't by itself inherently any more secure than a Word document. In most cases, you are better off writing down passwords in a physical book, as almost all thefts of passwords result from an attack via your computer, rather than someone getting hold of a password book. If you are going to write down sensitive school passwords in a book kept at school, obviously this should never be left on display when it is unattended, and it should always be locked away at the end of the day. You could also use a password manager program such as Dashlane, which will create and store complex passwords automatically for you so you don't have to remember them. You just need to make sure that you remember the master password to the whole account, as if you forget that, you would lose access to all your accounts in one go. Schools should consider introducing a password protocol on their email accounts. For example, passwords can be required to have a minimum length of, let's say, 8 characters and to include at least one uppercase letter, one lowercase letter, one number, and one symbol. Staff can also be forced to change their password at given intervals, say every 12 months. Two-factor authentication, or 2FA as it has recently become known, provides an extra layer of protection that is additional to your password. Having 2FA in place means that even if your password is discovered, unauthorized access cannot be achieved unless the requirements of this additional layer of protection is passed as well. Most commonly, this involves a text being sent to your mobile. Alternatively, a code might be generated by an app on your phone. To set up two-factor authentication, just Google 2FA plus the name of the account you want to protect, whether that's Gmail, Amazon, iPhone, etc. If 2FA is correctly configured, you will be alerted to any unexpected attempts to log into your account. However, it is always worth remembering that no matter what protection you have in place, the best protection from losing your data is always having an up-to-date backup of everything, just in case the worst comes to the worst. This backup should not be permanently connected to your computer, as if you were to become the subject of a successful ransomware attack, that backup drive would end up being encrypted along with all your other data. Recently, there has been a growing movement towards the ending the use of usernames and passwords altogether, by using instead unique digital keys known as passkeys. Unlike passwords, which as we all know are vulnerable to a number of hacking methods, passkeys are not susceptible to these threats. Unlike passwords, passkeys, for example, cannot be reused. This prevents the current situation where many people use the same password across multiple accounts. They can't be guessed, as unlike passwords, you have no involvement in their creation, so you cannot create ones that are easy for others to guess. They can't be forgotten. There is nothing for you to remember, as you won't actually know what they are in the first place. This also means that passkeys won't be vulnerable to phishing attempts. As you won't know what the passkeys are, and you don't have to type them in anywhere, there is no point in criminals either trying to get you to disclose what they are, or by trying to track your typing to see what they are. Also, as they are not stored on a remote database, this means they can't be obtained as part of a data breach. Passkeys will also remove the need for two-factor authentication. How passkeys work is pretty complex, and exactly how they will work depends on what device you are using and what you are using it for. However, fundamentally speaking, instead of creating a password for an online account, a pair of related cryptographic keys or passkeys will be generated, one of which is public, insofar as it is shared with the company you are setting up the account with, and the other which is private and which might, for example, be stored on your smartphone. Information will then be exchanged between the website and your device in order to authenticate your login. To ensure compatibility with as many devices as possible while still maintaining security, passkey technology will also utilize biometric authentication, e.g. your face or fingerprint, and Bluetooth connections. Microsoft, Google, and Apple are all pushing this new technology very strongly, so it is possible that, thanks to the adoption of passkeys, the use of passwords will almost completely disappear within the next few years. I'd now like to provide some brief reminders of what you should be doing to avoid data breaches during your working day. Whenever you have to communicate personal information, whether it is about a member of staff, a parent, or a pupil, You should limit what you share to what is absolutely necessary, and you should make sure that you are only sharing the information with those who actually need to know it. This will help minimize the effects of any data breach should one happen. The degree of caution you should take in providing information should be relative to the potential seriousness of the consequences should that information be shared inappropriately. You should take extra special care when you are dealing with particularly sensitive information. You are providing information to parents that are no longer living together. For example, if contact details are inappropriately shared with an ex-partner, this may not only result in a data breach, but it can have serious consequences for both the parent concerned and, as a result, the school itself. You should also take particular care when you are communicating with, dare I say it, one of the school's more challenging parents who you suspect may just be waiting for an opportunity to complain to the school. In any of these circumstances, where an inadvertent error could result in far-reaching repercussions, you should consider asking a colleague to check the information you are providing. This should include the contents of any attachments or enclosures. They should also check that it is going to the correct recipient and that the address being used, be it an email address or a home address, is up to date. It is not uncommon for data breaches to result from the wrong attachment or from an out-of-date address being used. Personal email addresses should not be visible to other recipients. Always use blind carbon copy, BCC, when sending group emails to personal email addresses. Try to avoid accidentally clicking on the Reply All button instead of the Reply button. Not everyone realizes that when you forward an email that is part of an email thread, and by that I mean a series of associated emails that have passed between you and someone else, the whole email thread would be forwarded and not just the most recent message. Those other messages could contain information that could be embarrassing and which you would rather the recipient didn't see, or, more seriously, they might contain sensitive and confidential data about others, and the release of which could result in a serious data breach. In order to avoid this, if you wish to send someone else information contained in an email thread, it is best to copy and paste just the information you want to forward into a brand new email and avoid the forward option altogether. Personal contact details should not be shared without the permission of that person. This includes if a parent asks if they can have the contact details of parents in order to invite children to their own child's birthday party. Try to avoid leaving confidential documents on the photocopier, and if you discover someone has left such a document behind, always return it to the appropriate person rather than leaving it where you found it. Sensitive or confidential letters should not be sent home via book bags. Whenever you are the last person to leave the school office, you should make sure that you lock the door to prevent unauthorized access. Whenever you are going to leave a computer unattended, you should return it to the login screen. The simplest way to do this is to get into the habit of pressing the Windows key and the L key at the same time, as this returns your PC straight to the login screen. Then when you come back, all you need to do is enter your password and everything will still be open as it was before you left, ready for you to carry on with what you were doing. Rather than having to remember to use that Windows key and L key combination, you can set up your computer to have a timeout function, where if you haven't used the computer for a while, it will automatically return to the login screen without you having to do anything. When working from home, it is acceptable to use your own personal computer to access school personal data held online, but this should not be downloaded to your personal PC except in exceptional circumstances. Even then, you should make sure that this information is deleted as soon as you have finished using it. You should never save school personal data to an unencrypted flash drive. Printed personal data should be disposed of using a crosscut shredder. While working at your computer, it is best to be aware of who is stood behind you, as they may be deliberately trying to see what you are doing. This activity now has its own term, shoulder surfing. Similarly, when talking on the phone, you should always be aware of who can hear what is being said. If a general conversation you are having over the phone suddenly changes to involve the discussion of sensitive information, it may be appropriate to move to another room before continuing that conversation. Before a parent is allowed to see a document they've requested to see, whether that request is part of a formal subject access request or just an everyday request made at the school reception desk, It's important to check that that document doesn't contain any other person's personal information. In particular, you should check that there's nothing on the back of that document which you don't expect to be there. At the end of the day, don't forget to log off your computer, put away any files, and lock any lockable filing cabinets. You should never be afraid to report a data breach, as the quicker a breach is reported, the sooner things can be done to reduce the effects of what has happened. It is important to immediately tell the senior administrator and the head teacher that the breach has happened, so that they can immediately contact me to discuss what needs to be done next. Data protection legislation only allows 72 hours between a breach happening and it having to be reported to the Information Commissioner's office. Within that time, I have to investigate what has happened, speak to anyone I may need to speak to involved in the breach, and discuss with the head teacher or executive head teacher what action needs to be taken. It is the data protection officer who decides whether or not a breach needs to be reported to the ICO and who makes that actual report. I have recently created a checklist on which a school can base occasional data protection walkarounds and on which to record the results. Performing a data protection walkaround will help raise awareness of data protection within the school, identify any weaknesses in current data protection practices or in staff knowledge or understanding, inform an action plan to remedy any existing weaknesses in current practice, help avoid preventable data breaches, and enable the school to evidence its existing commitment to data protection should this come under question at any time, for example as a result of a data breach. It is important to recognise that any such walkarounds will not be conducted with the intention of catching out individual members of staff, but rather to identify where any improvements can be made which would be of a benefit to the school as a whole. The last subject I want to discuss in this training is subject access requests. These allow parents and children to request information held about them by a school. A subject access request can be made by letter, email, via the school's official social media if they have such a thing, or verbally. This may be either in person or over the phone. Research shows that around half of all subject access requests received by educational establishments are not handled correctly. Half of all the complaints received by the ICO about schools relate to subject access requests, so this is why it's so important that any requests received by the school are handled correctly. A subject access request doesn't have to be made to a specific person within the school, so a request that is made to any member of school staff is a valid request. The school has 1 month in which to meet a subject access request, so it is important that everyone knows how to recognise such a request, so that I can be informed about it as soon as possible. If any member of staff is asked by parents for the information held about them or their child, this request should be immediately referred to a school administrator, who needs to refer it to me as soon as practical. A subject access request can also be made by a third party, such as the parent's solicitor. In this case, it is always important to verify that the solicitor actually has the parent's consent to make the application. Requests for information held by a school are also quite often made by the police as part of an investigation. Once the subject access request has been received, it may be necessary to verify the identity of the person who is making the request. Also, a decision has to be made as to how the information would be provided, that is, whether the printouts would be given or, as is increasingly the case, an electronic version. All information held by the school needs to be collated, and this will include emails, which often forms the biggest part. Third parties that are separate from the school may need to be contacted for consent to release information. It is important to realise that records cannot be withheld simply because their content is embarrassing. Also, records cannot be disposed of after a subject access request has been received, as to do so would be a criminal offence. This is why it's important to carefully consider what you write in school records at the time they are written. There may be occasions when it would be worth considering if it is possible to write what you want to say in a way that might be less inflammatory should a parent end up seeing the records. If you have had a particularly frustrating day with a parent, it is worth thinking about whether a conversation with a colleague might be better shared face-to-face or over the phone, rather than committing it to a written record, even if this is only in an email. Having said all this, it is important to recognise that records of concerns about a child's welfare must always be recorded in an open way that records whatever is necessary to be recorded. Such records that might put a pupil's safety at risk would not be released to the parent anyway under a subject access request. Once the necessary documentation has been collated for the subject access request, it is provided to me for review and redaction. I then return a redacted version of the files to the school, ready to be provided to the parent. That's the end of today's training. If you think of any questions you would like to ask, or if you would like further training on any aspect of data protection, please feel free to contact me at dpo@devonmorsfederation.devon.sch.uk. Thank you for completing this training. I hope you found it useful.